Thank you for joining me during these live internet studies. It's really an hour and a half long study. My name is Ariel bin Lyman Hanavi. There are two segments to our studies. The first segment is entitled, as you can see on your screen right now probably, Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We're really talking about the rapture at the moment, but that's not the exclusive topic. It is a study on the book of Revelation. We're just chugging away. We're working our way towards the book of Revelation, going through the topics that we are utilizing. The second segment of my hour and a half long study is called A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism, and we are discussing Bible verses that are either Trinitarian leaning or non-Trinitarian leaning. Fill in the blank with non-Trinitarian. But right now we're using Biblical Unitarian. So Trinitarian versus Biblical Unitarian is primarily the focus, and we're looking at Isaiah 43:11 at this point. So if you're interested in both studies, stick around for the entire study, okay? All right, let's jump into eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. Here is a look at the topical index. We are in topic number 11, making a case for the pre-wrath view of the rapture. So what is that view? Well, let me back up and talk about three other different views. There's two major views and two minor views in Christian circles these days. There's the view known as pre-tribulation rapture, in what is described as the 7-year tribulation period, which is the last 7-year period of history that's recognized in the Bible as the final, say, expression of man's rebellion against God, complete with the Antichrist, false prophet, and demonic activity and tribulation and day of the Lord and a lot of bad stuff, but also from the worst perspective, a lot of good stuff. This is the last 7 years where the Bible allows humans and Satan to make one final attempt to elevate their own importance over God, and God allows it. So we're looking at this time frame, and so it goes by a few different names. The 7-year tribulation, Daniel's 70th week, the last 7, the final 7, or some people who don't subscribe to a 7-year, I don't know, I think they just call it the tribulation, but we're looking at models that involve a 7-year time frame. That's why it looks the way it does on your screen right now. So where does pre-trib rapture believe that this rapture of the church is going to take place? In their model, there are two primary movements of Jesus in relationship to Christians and in relationship to planet Earth. In their model, the first of those two primary movements is Jesus coming back to rescue his saints before any of the bad stuff happens. So it's a pre-trib model that puts Christians outside of the tribulation time period altogether. There's no point of bringing Christians into this trib period. The second of those two events is when Jesus returns from heaven, this time to stay on earth. He returns with Christians in their model, and he stays on earth. He doesn't just meet us in the air and hover, but he stays on earth, and then he ushers in his millennial kingdom. So the pre-trib rapture is basically a rapture position that happens before any bad stuff is poured out. And therefore, all of the tribulation and rapture passages that we find in the Bible are related to this view that it's an anytime, sudden, without any announcement, without any warning, without any signs, imminent rapture. Imminent in the sense that it could happen at any moment. There's nothing that needs to come in front of it. It just could happen suddenly. It's secret in that only Christians are going to be aware of it. It's in the twinkling of an eye. So unbelievers won't even really know what happened until they just look around and realize that a lot of people are gone. And who knows? They might not even equate it with a rapture. They might not understand what happened. They just might think that maybe a bunch of people called in sick from work, who knows? So that's pre-trib rapture. Don't worry. I'm purposely minimalizing my explanation of it because we'll get into it later on, but I'm just giving you the overview. A position that's a minority is called mid-trib, and in this slide or this model, they describe the same phenomenon that pre-tribbers do, in that Christians are not going to go through any great tribulation, and so we're raptured before this great tribulation of persecution against Christians before that takes place. The only difference is this rapture takes place in the middle of that 7-year time frame. That's why they call it mid-trib. And there are some other details about the mid-trib rapture that I'm purposely not mentioning, such as they feel that the timing is related to the seventh trumpet in the book of Revelation, and they also have some perspective about God's wrath being only half the length of pre-tribbers, like you're seeing on my screen. So they don't put us through any of God's wrath. They say that all of that is half that size, but they still take us out of the way before tribulation is poured out. In the post-trib rapture, this is a majority position. This one has the rapture at the far right, where it was earlier, it was at the far left or in the middle. Now the rapture is all the way swung to the other side, and it is essentially synonymous with second coming. In this particular model, or this version of of post-trib, Christians go through the entire 7-year tribulation period. They also go through all of God's wrath. However, they're supernaturally protected from God's wrath in a manner that is reminiscent of Israel's protection during the plagues of Egypt, or other times in Israel's history where God protected them from her enemies, or protected them from himself, is apparently what they're assuming when they say protection from God's wrath. But in this model, the second coming isn't really seen as a second event. Rather, many post-tribbers are fond of describing their understanding of rapture as one movement, one coming of Christ to planet Earth. Even if you go with the fact that, and we're going to see this in a moment, even if you go with the fact that there are versions of post-trib that teach that God's wrath belongs on the right side of the tribulation in my chart, meaning we don't go through God's wrath, but we do go through tribulation in general. These type of post-tribbers are recently, they like to add the label pre-wrath next to their post-trib description. So they call themselves post-trib pre-wrath. What they mean by that is, and we'll see here in a moment, that there's a version of post-trib that says, no, God doesn't need to protect us through wrath because we're actually going to be excused from it. So it's a version of being excused from the wrath of God, but still going through all of the wrath of Satan, or the tribulation, we could call it. And it's in their version, the timing is still very, very close to what we call second coming. So that's part of their view. And then the final view that is open on our discussion table is the pre-wrath rapture. This is another minority view. It's the newest of all the views. This is a mere 30 years old. I think it really gained prominence in the 90s. With Marv Rosenthal's book, The Pre-Wrath Rapture of the Church, followed, I think, like 2 years later with The Sign by Robert Van Kampen in 92. And really, if I understand it correctly, the two books were basically the same material because they were put together by friends, two friends, Rosenthal and Van Kampen. They're friends with one another, and they corroborated their notes against one another. So it wasn't that it was a competition in the books and the material. Rather, it's the same viewpoint, just put out by two different friends that were both holding to the same view. So I guess I could tell you that in terms of rapture views, it doesn't matter which book you read, you're going to get the same pre-wrath perspective. But I can recommend that The Sign is the book you want to read ultimately, because it's more than just rapture. It's a discussion of end times as a whole. It discusses Daniel's 70th week. It discusses the beast empires of Antichrist. It discusses the identity of Mystery Babylon. It discusses a lot more than just talking about rapture, whereas Rosenthal's book, The Pre-Wrath Rapture Church, is primarily an expose on the pre-wrath position itself. And Van Kampen's book contains two whole chapters entitled The Pre-Wrath Rapture. So it's kind of like Van Kampen took the other book, the earlier book, and stuck it inside his book. His Van Kampen's book is a lot longer in length, a lot thicker, covers a lot more details, like I said. So in this model, where's the rapture? Instead of being at the very beginning like a pre-trib model, instead of being at the middle like the mid-trib model, and instead of being at the farthest end, synonymous with second coming like the post-trib model, pre-wrath says we believers go through tribulation, but we're rescued before the wrath of God begins. It's that simple, in that pre-wrath is truly post-trib post-trib, pre-wrath as well. But not to be confused with the other version of post-trib, pre-wrath that I was mentioning. Pre-wrath model allows for God's wrath to be played out over a space of time that recognizes that there is a different event known as rapture. That rapture event and second coming are two separate events. So pre-wrath harmonizes some of the details that are brought into the table of discussion by post-trib, and it harmonizes some of the details that are brought into the table of discussion by pre-trib. So it is a synthesis, in many ways, of all the views that came before it. It seeks to retain the truths of those positions and yet discard the inadequacies and inconsistencies of those other positions where they run into difficulties with the text. It seeks to harmonize all the text by saying there's no contradiction if we allow for this particular model, which is why this is the model that I hold to. Okay, so here's just really another view of some of the views, another slide that represents these views. These other slides are just going to show them all in one slide, except for when we get to the final slide here. It's just going to be one view. Here's the same four views: pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, post-trib, just in a different order, but essentially the same theology that I've been describing. The rapture slides into different places on the 7-year frame, which indicates to me that not all of us can be right? And sometimes the pre-wrath and the post-trib sometimes the mid, the pre, and the post have so much in common that I think we're all saying the same thing, just we're just kind of adjusting the length of the wrath of God. But again, in terms of pre-trib, this is a radical departure from the other three. Well, I suppose not so radical from mid-trib in my opinion, but nevertheless, this is a good way to look at the four views if you're a little bit confused. You got the little rapture circle in the middle that you can see. Here's another slide representing essentially the same thing that I just showed you. Rapture just slides up and down the 7-year scale, and you have different interpretations of where it shows up based on how you understand the phrases tribulation and wrath and things like that. Really, it amounts to some disagreements over the term tribulation and wrath in the Bible, and we'll talk about that probably tonight. This particular slide that I'm showing you now is of interest because when you look at the post-trib in the lower left corner, this doesn't look like the previous slide. Let me go backwards so you can catch this. Look at the post-trib on this slide. It's a third down. In this version of post-trib, wrath of God happens first, rapture happens second. So rapture is at the end of the 7 years, and that means that Christians go through all of the bad stuff. We go through the tribulation as well as the wrath of God, and yet we are probably protected by God through the wrath. So we're not being punished by God, but we're not in heaven either. We are on planet Earth, but we're protected in some supernatural fashion like God did to the ancient Israelites in Goshen and in Egypt during the plagues. Go back and read the story in Exodus chapter 6, maybe, Exodus, and then just go from there. Okay, but look at this version of post-trib. Where's the rapture? It's in front of the day of the Lord. So it's swapped positions. I mean, as in completely opposite of one another. It's still near the end of the week, like the other version of post-trib, and the name still implies, when it says post-trib, it still implies that Christians go through tribulation. That doesn't change. But the thing that does change is that Christians suddenly don't go through the wrath of God, which I think is a very important change. If I were not a pre-wrather, notice that in this chart, the post-trib and the pre-wrath are very, very similar in their theology. The only difference, because you can compare the two bottom slides is what I'm referring to, the only big difference in their theology or their explanation or articulation is the length of the day of the Lord. And so I find that I have a lot of discussion with people who are post-trib, pre-wrath, and I myself am pre-wrath, post-trib. Maybe I'm differentiating in the names only because my position seeks to recognize that the day of the Lord is a bit longer than the post-trib, pre-wrath version of the day of the Lord. But other than that, when I have discussions with post-trib pre-wrathers, those who put themselves going through the tribulation but being excused from the wrath, I have a lot of affinity with their explanation because we're really just talking about differences in the length of the day of the Lord. So that's what I wanted you to see on this particular chart, is that more and more when you go on the internet and you find people saying there's no rapture, we're going to go through the tribulation, but we're going to be protected by God from God's wrath, or we're going to be excused from God's wrath. They're probably describing themselves as a post-trib pre-wrath, but not the flavor of pre-wrath that I hold to. At least I don't think they are. They could be, because the name label pre-wrath in the version that I am holding to is often unfamiliar to a lot of people. So we have a lot of how do we say? It is confusion, but only to the degree that you got a bunch of people talking about similar topics and timings and events of importance, but many of them not realizing that there are labels that are in use for what they're talking about already, number one, positions, and perhaps that the position that they hold to has already been articulated by someone else of prominence. Maybe it's already been written about in a book. It's already been studied out. It's been examined by some theologian. And maybe people just aren't aware that there is a position out there that is a description of what they believe. They just don't know that. They just know they've read the Bible and this is the position they come to. So you're finding a lot of people these days that are leaving and abandoning pre-trib in its classic sense of, hey, we Christians are supposed to go through tribulation. So they automatically leave that articulation of pre-trib behind when they say, we believe we're going to go through tribulation. It's just that when they get to verses that talk about the rapture, they don't know how long the day of the Lord is. Perhaps they simply think that it's probably closer to the end of the week, and therefore when they hear that the version of post-trib puts rapture near the end of the week, they automatically think, oh, that must be the view I hold to, not realizing that the pre-wrath view that I hold to also puts rapture closer to the end of the week. So you don't have to be a classic post-tribber. You can also be a pre-wrather, or maybe it's not necessary to quibble over these titles since they're so closely resembling one another. But the pre-trib and the mid-trib that you can see on this screen, they both have a view that largely keeps Christians out of the tribulation as best as they can. So here's one last view that I'll talk about, and then I'll jump into the study. This one is described by Brother Joel Richardson, who we did a study on in my eschatology study here. We took a look at his Antichrist model, a version of Antichrist that's a Muslim Antichrist, and he believes that the rapture is at the end of the 70th week. So if you notice, he puts the red arrow right at the very end of the 70th week, which, interesting if this arrow is accurate. I mean, I took this right from the resource that he provided, I believe, if I remember where I got this chart. And he calls his version a hybrid model, so I think that's why it says hybrid pre-wrath post-trib. Notice the names in the lower left corner. Hybrid pre-wrath post-trib. He's seeking to harmonize the two views that are very closely related, which is pre-wrath and post-trib. Those two views have a lot of similarities, like I've already described. He puts the rapture at the final end, which I don't know if in doing so is he aware that he's able to accurately pinpoint, almost date set, when Christ comes back, even though it's commonly taught that we shouldn't know exactly the day or the hour. Therefore, how could you put the rapture happening right at the very end of the 7 years? To the degree that anyone can know when the 7 years starts, at least from the beginning or the midpoint, then one can calculate using simple math as to when the 70th week should end. And if the rapture is on that day, then suddenly we do know the day or the hour. We know the day. Maybe we don't know the hour, but we know the day. And so we have to talk about those details. So I don't know that this, I personally don't think that this is the accurate view. I think it's better to push the rapture closer to the center so that we don't know when the day is. Or push it farther to the right into the 30 and 45 day period so that we say that we don't know exactly which day out of those 30 and 45 days that it happens. But either way, the point is Joel Richardson puts us as being raptured in the middle of the bowl judgment. I'm sorry, in the middle of the trumpet and bowl judgment, something to that effect happening in the middle of that. So there is some, if you notice, the bowls on the far right are after the rapture, but the trumpets start happening before the rapture. So I think he's trying to indicate that we get raptured at the seventh trumpet, like many post-tribbers teach also. They have that similarity with mid-tribbers, where they talk about this seventh trumpet rapture, which is connected in their mind to the last trump that Paul talks about. So they take the term last and equate it with the seventh, even though I think that's an exegetical leap myself. There's no reason to believe. I think that's anachronism, is the point I'm trying to say. Paul didn't use the word seventh, and John didn't use the word last. The same Greek words, even the same English words, are different. The Greek and the English are both different. And I think that's not the only reason to think that they're different, but we'll talk about that in a different day. But primarily, Joel Richardson, I think he puts rapture on the seventh trumpet, and then, but prior to any bowls that are poured out. So his is a pre-wrath, post-trib. He calls it a hybrid, but it's because if you look at the blue things, those are seals. He has the seals going all the way, occupying the entire length of the 70th week, as well as the 30 and 45 days that are extended beyond the 70th week. Versus, if we get to this view, if you look at the, this, by the way, is a pre-wrath view. If you look at the seals running along the bottom, the timing of the seals is more in line with my understanding. This is a chart that I would, as far as I can tell, I agree with 100%. Timing of the seals down at the bottom, and the timing of the 7 years, and the explanation of what events take place along the time markers of first of the week, middle of the week, and then later on into the week. We have rapture happening after tribulation, so it's post-trib, obviously. And also rapture happens prior to the day of the Lord, that yellow arrow, so it's pre-wrath, obviously. And notice the timing of the rapture, where it says coming of the Son of Man, date unknown. In case you're not following it, it's I'm moving my mouse over it right now for those who are in my live class, where it says coming of the Son of Man, date unknown. So this is a post-trib, pre-wrath model, but it's more classically identified as simply pre-wrath, not to be confused with the new version called post-trib, pre-wrath, that is really post-trib, but a rapture that happens prior to a wrath of God being poured out. As confusing as that can be sometimes. So those are the charts